Welcome, everyone. My name is Sipati Mokhema from the Southern Center of Inequality Studies. Today, we're having our 6th policy dialogue organized and hosted by the Future of Workers team here at the Southern Center of Inequality Studies at Wits University. Our dialogue today, we have 3 panelists who will be making presentations related to state interventions as well as regulatory and redistributive framework related to regulating the gig economy. So today's dialogue is actually titled The Redistributive and Regulatory Role of the State in the Digital Economy. Of our 3 panelists, we have our first speaker. Her name is Dr. Abigail Osiki. Dr. Abigail Osiki is affiliated with the University of the Western Cape. She currently lectures in the Mercantile and Labour Law Department at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. She's also a research associate at the Center for Transformative Regulation of Framework, UWC Cape Town. Abigail's background is in working poverty, non-standard forms of work, sustainable development and policy reform, with a special interest in the informal economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Abigail was formerly a postdoctoral fellow in the FOWEB project. She holds a PhD in labor law from the University of Cape Town. Dr. Abigail Osiki, it's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sepati. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Abigail.
Thank you. So I'll be talking generally. I'll be looking at social protection system in in Nigeria. Platform work offers a potential solution to some of the developmental challenges in Nigeria. However, because of the decent work deficit experienced by many platform workers, there is need generally for policy reform to ensure that workers have adequate social protection. So in looking at the extension of social protection to platform workers, I would start by discussing the context of platform work in Nigeria. I will highlight some of the advantages and the challenges of platform work in the country, and then I would focus on the existing social protection system in Nigeria. And finally, I would reflect on how social protection can be extended to platform workers in an equitable and sustainable, and inclusive manner, such that every worker is protected. Now, the platform economy in Nigeria, the context, one of the major things is the developmental challenges in Nigeria, such as the high poverty rates, not just generally amongst the general populace, but also the high poverty rate amongst graduates in terms of the gaps in school to work transition in the country, which has led to Nigeria having high youth unemployment, brain drain, among other socioeconomic consequences, and low barrier entry to the platform economy. And more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic are some of the factors that has enabled the growth of the platform economy in Nigeria. Now, in terms of the size of the platform economy, or even the numbers of platform workers in the country, there really no statistics that give exact number or give exact size. But in terms of the participants in the platform economy, there are some indicators. A research in 2020, for example, said that for every 1,000 adults, there are 11 users of digital platform labor in Nigeria. So looking at that figure, we can argue that 1.2 million users participate in platform economy in Nigeria. However, this is quite small when you compare it to other sectors in Nigeria. For example, the agricultural sector, which is a source of employment to over 30%, to over 35% of adults in the country, and other subsectors in the service industry, for example, the wholesale and retail sector, which is a huge source of employment to Nigerians. So even though platform work has the potential to contribute to employment, till date, the contribution is still small. Now, the other thing with platform work in Nigeria is also choice. Unlike many jurisdictions, for example, in Kenya, platform workers have found is actually more location based because of the low skill level required for location-based platform work, and because of also the ease of entry, unlike cloud work, which requires certain skills. But interestingly, cloud work has proven to be a huge source of employment for many Nigerian graduates because of the skills required for this particular kind of platform work. And then in many ways, platform work in Nigeria also overlaps with informality in terms of it's also not regulated in law, it's not regulated in practice. A lot of platform workers are just left on their own. Now, the question is, despite the obvious challenges or the lack of regulatory intervention in the platform economy in Nigeria, the question is, why is it attractive? A key reason why it is attractive is because of job creation. Now, particularly, as I said previously, Nigeria, the youth unemployment rate in Nigeria is very high. Many young people who are graduates of higher education do not have access to employment. So platform economy offers a source of employment for many of these young adults. So even though the contribution of the platform economy is modest compared to other sectors, for a lot of young people, it's a good source of employment. And not forgetting the fact that the unemployment rate in Nigeria, for example, is over 33%, which is significant. And then the other reason why platform work is attractive to Nigerians is also improved wage outcome for some, particularly e-hailing drivers. Now, the minimum wage in Nigeria is 30,000 Naira, which is less than $50. But with e-hailing drivers, for example, there's the possibility of making more than 5 times the national minimum wage. And this makes it very attractive to many Nigerians. However, this is not taking into consideration the fact that workers remain responsible for maintaining the tools of trade, getting access to data, having a good phone, maintaining the car, for example. And then the other reason why platform work is attractive is because of the wider client reach. Now, informal drivers, typically in Nigeria, for example, I'm using transportation as an example. Informal drivers, typically in Nigeria, are found at specific locations. So it means that their client reach is limited to that particular location, unlike the access apps gives to many e-hailing drivers, for example, or even domestic workers on platforms. The final one is flexibility, which is one of the major things. As we know, platforms globally have been using as a bargaining tool. Platform offers the possibility to determine when, how, and where you perform work, which makes it very easy for a lot of workers. But however, there are challenges that comes with platform work, and if regulatory interventions are not, if there are no regulatory interventions, it means that these workers, even though they're working, there's a possibility that they find themselves in situations of working poverty. They remain vulnerable and to exploitation by platforms. Now, as attractive as platform work is, there's the other side of the coin for many Nigerian platform workers. Regulation has not focused on the working conditions of platform workers. Regulation has actually mainly been on the commercial side in terms of government thinking of ways tax platform workers or to tax platforms without considering the working conditions of workers. So for example, in Lagos State, which is the biggest commercial center of Nigeria, or is the economic nerve of Nigeria, there's the guidelines for online e-hailing drivers, which seeks ways to tax drivers. Drivers are expected to pay service tax, and without the government looking at the conditions of work of these drivers. And this has been a source of tension between organizers of platform workers and the government. The biggest thing with platform work in Nigeria, just like in many other jurisdictions, is misclassification. Now, despite the traits of platform work indicating that these workers are employees, they are classified as independent contractors. And in terms of the scope of the primary labor regulation in Nigeria, the Labor Act 2004, protection is only extended to workers who fall within the definition of employee. Workers who have employment contract, whether it is oral, whether it is written. The most important thing is that these workers are referred to as employees. And as a result of this exclusion, work conditions, protection for work conditions also is employee-based. And because of this, the workers, platform workers lack rights such as collective rights. They can't bargain. Of course, apart from the peculiarities or the unique features of platform work, because they are not classified as employees, these workers are outside the scope of protection of Nigerian Trade Union Act. And the final one is lack of social protection. Most of the social protection schemes in Nigeria are focused or are employee-based. So if you're not an employee, you cannot access, for example, the Employment Compensation Act, the Pensions Act, you can't access it. And besides this, there's also the issue of enforcement and compliance. Although recently Nigeria enacted the National Health Insurance Authority Act a few months ago, which was an overhaul of the previous National Health Insurance Scheme Act, which was solely employee-based. But this new act has been extended to all workers, all residents in the country, and specific mention was made of informal workers in Nigeria. But however, there are issues of implementation, enforcement, compliance, because, for example, one of the ways the government was thinking of financing this was through a telecommunication tax, which has been removed because people complained the government was shifting the burden of that telecommunication tax on Nigerians, which is also another way which would have had a disproportionate impact on vulnerable Nigerians. Now, the focus of this particular reflection is social protection. Now, the major thing with platform work is the lack of access to social protection. And this is because of the regulatory framework in Nigeria. Now, the first thing is Nigeria does not have an overarching social protection policy. Social protection or social security rights are in the Constitution, but they are not enforceable. So this means that the government cannot be held accountable for the lack of implementation of socioeconomic rights. And this also reflecting also how policies around socioeconomic rights are implemented. For example, the health budget in Nigeria is less than 5%. So it means that health, for example, which is of right to health, which is a form of socioeconomic rights, is not adequately financed by the government. And this is tied to the fact that socioeconomic rights are not recognized as fundamental in the Constitution. And of course, the other thing is existing social protection laws are tied to the employment status of workers. So unless you're an employee, you don't get access to it. And Indeed, many of the laws in Nigeria are outdated. For example, the Labor Act in Nigeria was enacted in 1978, which of course did not take into consideration the changes in the world of work or the advancement technology has brought, for example, the issue of platform workers. Then the other thing is, apart from the fact that existing social protection laws are linked to employment, they're also contribution-based. So this means that is linked to the income of the employee. The employee needs to contribute towards social protection, needs to contribute towards getting, towards pensions, towards gaining access to health insurance. And then the final thing is enforcement and compliance. Now, the implication of this is that for many workers, including particularly platform workers, they are vulnerable to the whims or the changes in the labor market. Their rights are undermined, and this exacerbates poverty and inequality in the country. And this is particularly interesting because currently Nigeria has the infamous reputation of being the poverty capital of the world. And this highlights the urgent need for social protection system in the country to evolve to ensure adequate social protection for all workers, not just while they're working, but throughout the lives of everyone. Now, the question is, how can we extend social protection to platform workers? I generally consider this looking at the social protection flaws recommendation of the ILO and the key principles that should guide social protection. And the first one is universality, which means that there's whatever the social protection system that we're developing in Nigeria needs to consider access for all types of workers, and it needs to be adapted, for example, to the particularity of their jobs. For example, platform workers, there's need for it to be transferable. This means that regardless of the sector, platform workers find themselves either in logistics, either in service, these workers can transfer the benefits of social protection. There's also need for risk sharing, because typically one of the ways many workers in Nigeria are able to protect themselves is by providing for private insurance, and this places undue burden on workers. There's gender mainstreaming. So what then does this mean for Nigerian for Nigerian platform workers? The first thing is the government has a role to play in extending social protection to workers. Now, there's a social contract between the government and workers that labor protection would be extended to all workers. And the question is, how will this play out? What does this mean in the context of social protection for platform workers? The first thing is the social protection system must be contributory and tax financed. We can't depend solely on tax financed social protection, because at best it will provide basic access to social protection given the budgetary constraints in Nigeria. So in looking at this, how should social protection be extended to platform workers? The first thing is, just like I said previously, it should not be linked to employment. It should be universal. It should be portable. Every worker, regardless of their type of employment, regardless of the peculiarity of their jobs, should have access to this, and it should suit their particular needs. Now, Nigeria is taking the first step in this through the enactment of the National Health Insurance Authority Act, which is applicable to all residents. But this is just one leg of social protection. We still have the issue of income protection. There's also pensions. You know, these are social protections rights, or flaws rather, that ideally should protect workers. Should protect workers against all sorts of socioeconomic risks. The other thing is, which I've highlighted, is there's a need for the employment status of workers to be clarified and Nigeria's legal framework to be updated to reflect the changes in the world of work. And there's also the need for administrative and financial procedures to be tailored to platform work. For example, Nigeria has the biometric verification number, which is equivalent to social security number in other countries, which can be used to ease the administration of social security. And because most of these workers already have access to technology, you need to have a phone to access this. Technology can be harnessed as a tool to extend deal with administrative bottlenecks and also financing. There are ways, rather than the government focusing on service charge for tax, this could be an alternative way to finance social protection for these workers. And then the final thing is there's a need for Nigeria to develop alternative financial procedures. Now, a popular thing in Nigeria has a form of local cooperative, which is called a SOSO, which has historically been used as a way for residents to support themselves against socioeconomic risk. And this is a well-established model in Nigeria, and this can be harnessed to extend protection to platform workers. Ultimately, the most important thing when we think about social protection system is that it needs to be human-centric. It needs to consider ways in which the rights to social protection or social security can be harnessed from platform workers, and this should guide the development of social protection system. The government has a role to play in it, which we can see. If the right regulatory environment is not provided, then at best the workers are left to the caprices of platforms who can unilaterally, as we keep seeing, determine the working conditions of these workers. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. of Inequality Studies. Dr. Castel Branco has a BA in Geography and African Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MA in Development Studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and a PhD in Sociology from the University of the West of Witwatersrand. Previously, Dr. Castel Branco worked at the International Labour Office in Mozambique and on social and maternity protection. She is an alumnus of the International Center for Development and Decent Work and a fellow of the Open Societies Foundation's Inequality Fellowship. Her research interests include agrarian transformation and the changing nature of work, informal workers' rights and organizations, and the redistributive role of the state in social protections. Dr. Ruth, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Sepati. And actually, I think that this next conversation really follows very well from Dr. Abigail Osiki's presentation. So I am going to be looking at the attempt to extend social insurance to informal workers or informalized workers in the Mozambican context. And let me just share my screen. And the reason that I've focused on social insurance is because, as Dr. Abigail Osiki said earlier, for countries like Mozambique, with still fairly limited redistributive capacity, tax-funded social protection is just one way, but perhaps it is not the only way. But then the question is, what is the way? So in defense of social insurance, is this first slide. And I think it's important to recognize that over the last years, the World Bank has really embraced a sort of model of universal social protection that's based on a sort of tax-funded, very residual minimum level of social benefits. And one of the arguments that it's made, and it's not entirely incorrect, is that social insurance schemes are limited in scope because they've been historically tied to formal employment. It then makes us a number of other more dubious arguments, like social insurance schemes promote informality, which actually Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing is organizing a seminar about tomorrow at 6 p.m. So if you're interested in kind of some of the debunking of the myths that the World Bank has proposed, that's a good seminar to check out. But anyway, back to this. And so the COVID pandemic highlighted the relevance of social protection, but it also exposed the gaps in national systems. And what we see is that although publicly funded income support has garnered increasing attention, social insurance does have some redeeming qualities. And so what are they? Well, number one, it holds capital directly accountable through employer contributions. So of course you have in a capitalist economy, various ways of redistributing surplus value, taxes being one, but not the only mechanism. And so this provides an alternative mechanism to do so. A second advantage is that it provides a higher level generally of benefits and a wider range of benefits. And Dr. Abigail Osiki spoke to that earlier. It also does not depend on the state capacity to mobilize resources through taxation or to reallocate resources from other forms of social provisioning, whether, healthcare, education, or other public goods. And in the context of Mozambique, we've seen that it's much more independent of donor interference. In other words, in countries like Mozambique, cash transfers have been driven largely through an international development agenda. And as Jimmy Adesina often says, the outcome of that is a sort of depoliticization of social protection debates. But of course, there are these limits, as I mentioned. So historically, social insurance has been tied to formal sector employment, which excludes informal workers and reduces the scope of coverage in the context of widespread informality. So in the case of Mozambique, 12% of the economically active population are salaried workers. Of those, half are public sector workers, and the other half are in the private sector, but only half of those are registered in social insurance schemes. So you have a high level of informality or informalization. And of course, this maps onto inequalities along the lines of gender, race, age, geographic location, and citizenship. And it penalizes uncommodified forms of work because it doesn't provide any kind of compensation, for instance, for caregiving. And ultimately, it abstracts from the role of the state in the process of the redistribution of rents, right? So proponents, for instance, of universal basic income might argue that that is a form of citizenship-based claim making on the basis of a rightful share. And also there's a sort of offsetting of the cost of social reproduction onto the household in the absence of adequate coverage under what we call sort of traditional social security. So in Mozambique, it's not unusual to hear, well, we don't need social protection because we have our shitiks, our stokvels, or other forms of non-state mediated forms of social security. But of course, there's a cost to those as well. Now, the problem is that recent attempts to extend social insurance to informal workers, and there have been a number. There's been sort of extending employer liability across global value chains, and WIGO documents this quite well, redefining what we term as worker to include those in contractual relationships. This would be sort of the debate around the reclassification, for instance, of platform workers away from their status as self-employed, and incorporating own account workers into schemes. And that's been the strategy that's been used in Mozambique. But of course, that's come with mixed results. So in 2015, the social insurance system in Mozambique decided to extend coverage to informal workers. And it did this by setting a sort of voluntary contribution rate of 7% of what was termed their sort of average monthly income, established by national minimum wage or sectoral minimum wages in that sector. So for instance, if you were a market vendor, you could say, well, I'm in the sector of retail, and then the social insurance scheme would calculate what the minimum wage was for that, and it would calculate 7% on the basis of that. Now, that is far higher than the contribution of salaried employees, which is 3%, because the government essentially said, well, under a normal system, salaried workers earn 3%, contribute 3%, employers contribute 4%. So as own account workers, because you're the worker and the employer, you're going to pay 7%, right? So this already shows the difficulties of how is it that you define what the contributory rates are and what kind of cross-subsidization is necessary where there's not a clear employer. The good thing about the Mozambican system, in comparison to the Angolan one, for instance, is that workers enjoy exactly the same benefits. Informal workers or workers under the own account regime enjoy exactly the same benefits as salaried workers, although the level of the benefit obviously depends on contributions, but this reduces the risk of discrimination. And in Mozambique, over 6 years, the National Insurance Institute was able to recruit over 50,000 workers, which was higher than its initial targets. But it had a huge level of desistência, of people that dropped out. And in fact, they could only retain about 22% of the original contributors. So then the question is why? And that's sort of where I came in and to think about, well, okay, what are workers' perceptions of social insurance? What are the challenges? What are the potential strategies for extending insurance to informal workers? And I decided, because the study was done during the pandemic, to work with workers that were on Bishkat, which is a digital labor platform. But as you can see, it's quite different, let's say, to an Uber. The majority of people registered on this platform are electrician, construction and repairs, catering, et cetera. So they are much more stereotypically own account workers rather than, let's say, involved in disguised employment relations. And here you can see that the majority of people in Bishkat were concentrated in Maputo, as well as province and city, as well as Nampula province. So there's a little bit of a sort of discrepancy in terms of the distribution. But so we did surveys, we conducted surveys through Bishkat with the people that were registered. And what we found was that they did consider social insurance relevant. And that's to be expected because we were at the height of the pandemic. And I think that there was really this kind of consciousness of the importance of social protection in these moments of crisis. And so almost all said that they would register with the fund, despite the fact that there's a long-term history of the ruling party using the funds from the social insurance schemes to fund party elections and other things. But there was still this kind of sense that this was a somewhat trustworthy institution. But the first challenge was the lack of accurate information over the procedures, what can be expected, how long it takes to claim benefits, et cetera. So there was a sense that although potentially trustworthy, it was not a reliable form of social protection. And we complemented some of the survey questions with also interviews. And this is an interview with the Domestic Workers Union, where they're talking about members that were under the same regime trying to apply for a maternity benefit. And it took 6 months for them to receive the maternity benefit, by which time, they had perhaps even stopped breastfeeding, right? So like the sort of the way that the social insurance system drags its feet, the way that the bureaucracies and the nature of power relations at the local level end up disempowering contributors means that people are quite reluctant to contribute. And this is associated with the complex and burdensome administrative procedures and the opportunity cost that's involved in traveling long distances, queuing for long periods. And this is particularly a problem for market vendors and others who have no way of continuing to earn an income when they're not in the workplace, right? And in addition, they don't benefit from some kind of employer who can act as an intermediary. There's no sort of process for automatic deductions, although the National Social Insurance System is looking into that. And there's a real kind of attempt to digitalize, but also digitalization in Mozambique is very limited. And so these systems are very uneven. The other thing that came up was inadequate benefits. So social insurance schemes were constructed around the idea of a permanent long-term employment. It takes in Mozambique 20 years of contributions in order to be able to accumulate enough to be able to benefit from a pension, for instance. Now, very few salaried employments now have those kinds of stable work histories, much less informal workers whose incomes are constantly oscillating, right? So this highlighted the need as we rethink social insurance to really emphasize the importance of short-term benefits and benefits, for instance, like unemployment insurance, which in Mozambique we don't have because unemployment should be covered by the employer and is thus in a different regime. But the other issue that came up were the inadequate financing arrangements. So the contributory regime assumes a regular monthly income. There's no cross-subsidization from the state. And ultimately, informal workers end up having to assume a higher contributory burden because they have to act as both the employer and the worker. And then, of course, contributions are calculated on the basis of sectoral minimum wages, which are extremely low, but they still correspond to the top 2 quintiles of the consumption distribution. And in other words, the top 40% of informal workers. So obviously what the study does is that it points to the need for an integrated approach, which does take into account some kind of phased expansion of social insurance by sector, as Dr. Abigail Osiki was saying, position in the labor process, but that has to be in some way cross-subsidized by the state. Combined with, of course, the expansion of social assistance through an increase in national budget allocations. And I think that the emergency grants that were introduced in Mozambique were an interesting experiment, which showed that the government could roll out social assistance, but they were ultimately short-lived. And so, what does this actually mean in the long run? Now, the other thing that's important to recognize is the need to redesign social insurance to respond actually to the needs of own account workers. You can't just pass a legislation that says, okay, now own account workers are included without thinking about the logic of organization of work and what that means. And so that involves, of course, dissemination of information, administrative processes, thinking about the eligibility criteria, adequacy of benefits and contributions, but ultimately building a social insurance scheme on the basis of voluntary contributions is extremely difficult. Actually, it's never been done, right? And so that's part of the reason that people can drop out of the system. And that puts the onus on social insurance schemes to really prove that they're worth it. Now, the other aspect is that in the context of Mozambique, and this points to the need for a sort of stronger labor regulations and also inspection and inspection services, is that in Mozambique, domestic workers are considered for the purposes of social insurance as own account workers, which they are obviously not. In fact, there are few sectors that are exposed to as much scrutiny and labor control as paid domestic work. And so there needs to be a revision of labor acts, right? To incorporate or to chip away at various sources of informalization. But that also requires better enforcement of labor protections. I think that we also need to think about the limits of social protection. I think that there's many contexts in which social protection becomes a sort of magic bullet for all problems. And it's obvious when you actually look into the case studies that there needs to be a better articulation between social insurance schemes, the generation of decent employment, other enforcement of labor and social protections, and also thinking about how the dynamics of the labor market are articulated with the structures of accumulation. So in the case of Mozambique, we have an extractive economy heavily dependent on foreign direct investment that is only interested in the extractive sector, a sector that absorbs 90% of investment and produces 15% of employment, right? And so you have a sort of dynamic, a conundrum, where you have an acceleration of expropriation with expansion of the extractive sector, but produces limited employment. And because of all the fiscal benefits that the extractive industry benefits from, it also undermines the redistributive capacity of the state. So you can't think about sort of expanding social insurance as a sort of way to get out of dealing with some of the major developmental issues. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so very much, Dr. Castel Franco. We will move on now to our third and final panelist, because before we have our discussant on, our third panelist is Advocate Mary Laura Perdomo Ospina. She is a regional coordinator for Latino America and Caribbean of ILO Network. She's also Colombian labor law specialist in constitutional law, specialist in human rights and international humanitarian law, an expert in international labor standards and the ILO standards supervisory system. She's a magistrate in labor law, former member of the specialization course for Latin American experts in labor relations at the Castilla-La Mancha University. She's a union advisor, advocacy for legal support for the Colombian trade unions, an ILO external consultant, researcher on labor issues panelist, and she is a litigant and labor arbitrator. Advocate Mary Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you especially for the invitation to this panel. I am very happy to be in a woman panel. It's great to participate with these great colleagues. I want to apologize for my English, but I really try to do my best. I want to talk with you about the regulative and right. I want to talk with you about the judicial protection and regulation of work on digital platforms, because I think it's an ineffective law against the corporative power of platform companies. I want to talk about first a judicial decision regarding the work of digital platforms in the world, and of course I want to do a focus in Latin America and Caribbean, that is my region. I want to talk about the normative regulation and the models of regulation on platform work, and at the end my conclusion or my ideas about this topic. First time, we have a database in ILO network about the judicial decision in different countries around the world on a relationship between platforms and workers for digital platforms. We have like 76, I'm sorry, this is big. 76 judicial decisions identified around the world, and of that decision we have like 15 from Latin America and Caribbean. Especially the first decisions are from Chile, and we have others from Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Uruguay. Uruguay is the first country that adopts judicial decision to define the relationship between a worker with a digital platform. We won in that case because the judge or the court recognized the labor relationship and used the ILO recommendation 198, and that is the only case in Latin America when the courts have used this recommendation, this ILO recommendation. But you can see in this graphic that the most of the judicial decisions are in the North global, especially in United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. We identify the results of those decisions in courts, and we have that the most of them for identify the relationship between the platform and the workers are about transportation, or especially Uber cases, and we have like 40% cases from deliveries, because for example in Latin America we have a lot of service, a lot of work in the delivery services, especially an enterprise called Rappi, that actually it's a Colombian platform of delivery of food especially. And we have just one case about digital platform on domestic work. we can find in our database and in the analysis of those decisions that the most of the cases, like 64%, we have won. I mean, the courts have declared that the relationship is a labor relationship, and recognize the qualification of as employee of workers. And we have 11 cases when the courts say that those cases are, or those workers are self-employed. And we have 8 cases where the courts say that they are independent contractors. And we have 2 cases where, especially in the UK, when they say that they are worker. Worker is a third category that the UK have for say that the worker is not an employee, is not an self-employed, and they are like a different kind of worker that have a bit of independence and a bit of protection in that law system. And we have some cases of the 76 cases or the judicial decision, we have 17 that refers about another issue. It's not for declare the relationship nature, but is for declare, for example, if arbitration clause is applied in the case, or if they are under the freedom association protection or other issues. I can leave you this PPT for, of course, because we have short time for this presentation. And about regulations of models of a specific normative regulation of digital platforms work, we can identify 3 models to regulate the digital platform work. We can, first one, that is a regulation as a third category, different than employee or self-employed. It's like an intermediate model. We can see this, for example, in United Kingdom with the case of workers that I mentioned. And we have the case of Spain, that they have a law about independent contract, but with a kind of protection as employer, but it's a different case. And we identify risk in that model of regulation because, of course, atomizes the regulatory models. We have different kind of contracts or different kind of work when, even if we think that the work and dependent work is similar, independent of the use of technology. That is our theory from Island Network. And this first model have to the risk to have distance platform work from recognizing its subordinate and dependent nature, and of course legalize unequal treatment among workers. We have a second model for regulate the digital platform work. For example, that model is a strengthening of the presumption of existence of the employment contract, and of course reversal of the burden of proof. In those cases, the platform have to prove if they say that the workers are independent, they have to prove it. Then we think that is a good model. Actually, we can see the examples in California with the law AB5. We can see the Spain law, the rider law that was adopted by an agreement, a tripartite agreement between the trade unions, the employers organization, and with the government. That is a good model for us. It's a law that have just one article, one clause to say, we presume that the relationship in a transport and delivery platforms, it's a labor relationship. And we have a draft directive for in the European Union, but actually this month they have to discuss and approve or deny, of course, that initiative. This model of regulation, of course, have risk too. For example, this is the best way on my point of view, but this way causes more reactions from the platform works, digital platforms, sorry. And of course, they use their lobby and they use their power and they use their money to try to stop those kind of regulations in the world. And we have a third model to regulate the digital platforms when they don't need to define the nature of the relationship between the digital platform and the workers, but they try to give some labor rights or some protection for the workers without definition about the nature of the relationship. We have that example in Chile, is the first law adopted in Latin America and Caribbean, and that was in March of this year. Then about Latin America, of course, I just mentioned, we have one law in Chile. That law opt for the minimum rights model, regardless of classification. They say the platform workers can be independent or can be dependent workers, but it doesn't matter. You're gonna have a minimum wage. You're gonna have a collective rights. You're gonna have, for example, a kind of social protection. But finally, the workers have to go to the judicial courts for decide the nature of the relationship, but they have like a minimum guarantees. We have more than 17 bills or draft laws in our region in 10 different countries. But we have like 3 important initiatives. We have one draft law in Uruguay from the government, and this model that the Uruguay government preferred is the model to say the platform and the worker can agree the kind of relationship between them. And we know as labor lawyers that that is impossible, because when you are a worker in front to a big platform, digital platform, the digital platform has the power to decide the kind of relationship. We have one draft law in Mexico from the government, and that is a great draft law. We are waiting for that because that law want to recognize the labor relationship between digital platform and the workers. And we have the last one, a good example in my country, in Colombia, when the government, the recent elected government promised to the country to recognize the labor relationship between workers and digital platforms. And we are working in that with the union, UNIDAP, that is the Platform Workers Union. With more than 1,000 members in the country. And we are working between the union, the academy, and the senators of the government, the current government, in a draft law for apply this model to a presumption of the relationship, labor relationship between digital platforms and the workers. And we present, or the union present, and the union and the trade union present, proposed to a Rappi. Rappi is this platform on delivery. We present a proposal to collective bargaining, but we present since July of this year. And of course, the digital platform had not answered to this moment. Then we are waiting. We present a complaint to the labor inspection, and we are waiting very, very soon decision of the labor inspection to sanction to Rappi for don't listen the request of this union. Then I don't know if I have time yet. Okay, just for the conclusion.
1 minute, thank you.
Okay, in the last minute, we have those conclusions. We think that the judicial decisions are still very few in relation to the number of workers, of course, in the world. And we think that, those judicial decisions have legal insecurity because the jurisprudence is not uniform. It is mixed between countries and even between same country. For example, we have in Brazil decision for declare the labor relationship, and we have decision in Brazil to say that they are self-employed. And in Latin America, there is still no decision by a high court. Then we have decision from a judge, but not the Supreme Court in any country. We think that in Latin America is a region which a very low self-regulation. We don't have a good experience on collective bargaining. Then we are so far to can discuss those labor conditions with the platforms. We have only 2 countries have used the labor inspection and work on digital platforms. Those are Argentina and Chile, but of course they sanctions the digital platforms, but the digital platforms, it doesn't care. They still against the labor rights of the workers. The 2 cases of presumption of employment that I mentioned, like California or Spain. In California, Uber used his power, his money to annulate this AB 5 law to the presumption of a labor relationship, and the experience of Spain that was a great agreement between workers and employers is not applied yet. And of course, the other modality of regulation refers to definition of the nature of the link to the agreement of the parties or to a judicial decision. Then they are not a good or rapid responses from state to protect the workers in platform and digital platforms. Thank you.
All right, thank you so very much, Advocate Mary. Thank you very much to all our 3 panelists. Now we'll be moving on to our discussant, Professor Sarah Cook. Professor Sarah Cook is a visiting researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies here at Wits University, and she's an honorary associate professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where she was an inaugural director at the Institute for Global Development. She's a social economist and China specialist, and her research has focused on China's social and economic transformations, including on issues of labor, inequality, social policy, and gender. She was previously director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and UNICEF's Office of Research in Ascensi. Professor Cook, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sepati, and thank you to the organizers, and it's a great pleasure to participate. And first, let me well, acknowledge the excellent contributions that we've heard. And I know we will have limited time, so I'm really keen to also allow time for all the questions from them. I think they've provided some very in-depth and specific context and studies, particularly in terms of the extension of social and legal protections to platform workers or workers in the digital economy. Some of the issues they raise are not new, issues around informality and how to extend social insurance, etc., but take on particular forms or are intensified in these contexts. And I think all of them are really worth a lot more discussion. And I'm sure you'll have questions. So what I'll do is offer a few reflections more generally on what I see as the key, some of the issues around the regulatory and redistributive roles of the state in terms of work in the digital economy, and weave in a few reflections on the interventions as well. And so first, I think initially we were going to have two separate dialogues in this regulation redistribution. And I think it's really good that by chance they were brought together in this seminar, which forces us to think about them together rather than separately. And for me, it's been an opportunity to reflect more broadly on the changing role of the state in the context of these digital technological so-called revolutions for some, and the relationship between them. And I'll try and just be brief on three sets of reflection. So one more general thought on the role of states and what are these roles? You know, there's a normative dimension. What should states be doing? Who decides that? By extension, who holds states accountable and how? And we've talked about movements, organized labor protests in former sessions. And then perhaps what we can call a positive aspect, what capacities, institutional, administrative, what space, fiscal, policy, political, do states have to do what they should or would like to do? And how are these affected by the broader changes such as digitalization? Obviously, we're talking about countries largely in the so-called global South. And I think the normative role is the one that's often associated then with what we call the redistributive role of the state. And I think that's really rooted in the forms that we've heard talking about, social insurance, etc., rooted principally in the emergence of welfare states in the North, global North, beyond minimum protection of the destitute, vagrants, homeless, sick, etc., to incorporate a broader set of protections, including for labor. And then, of course, embedded in the international human rights regime. So we have the rights to social protection, freedom of association, other rights, health, education, etc. Of course, there have been more radical redistributive ideologies in terms of what states could or should do, but they're tend not to be on the agenda so much at the current moment. So then the question, I think, is what really constitutes redistribution in these contexts that we're dealing with, which are excessive inequalities, not unrelatedly high levels of unemployment that Abigail, I think, has highlighted very clearly. And these are then important ideological choices of the state. And I think the current debates on redistribution really give the state a very minimalist, what my predecessor at UNRWA, Thandika Mkandawiri, would have called a handmaiden role. There's very little redistributive content in current forms of social assistance, the minimal social protection, 1 to 2% of GDP perhaps. And the same if you talk about social insurance that Ruth was talking about, with no state contribution to social insurance. It is about obviously how the surplus, so-called surplus value is distributed. But at the same time, then we need to think about the regulatory choices that we're hearing about are also largely distributive choices between sectors, perhaps, but also and primarily between labor and capital. And so I think that's where, you know, putting these together and looking at regulation together has been really useful. So the notions of a regulatory state coming out of, say, the regulation school takes a neo-Marxist approach, the way in which understanding the ways in which the state accommodates capital or develops new forms of regulation, new legal frameworks emerge to modify, but to facilitate and often to support capital. And I think we've heard a little bit that, you know, the Nigerian case and some of Mary's work seem to be suggesting that. So in contexts that we're looking at, the broader context of neoliberalism, we've seen obviously ideological movements away from a more active role of the state, public ownership, national industries, government provision, etc., towards a very minimal role where state responsibility aims at correcting market failures, imperfections, creating an environment for market-led growth, outsourcing services, etc. And so reducing the role of the state to dimensions except those that essentially support business. And obviously in this context where elites can exercise strong influence in the political system. So the distributional outcomes then depend in large part on what we call the functional distribution, the distribution of assets or wealth, and relatedly the power of capital or elites, and then the relative returns to labor and capital. And these labor being people who depend on their labor for income and livelihoods. And I suppose one assumption often is that this has intensified, been more concentrated with, certainly with financialization and with platform or digital capitalism. So these distributional questions are effectively inseparable from the regulatory role of the state, and the state is regulating for whom and in whose interests. So that was my first set of sort of just thinking about these two things and how useful it is to be reflective and critical of the language we use when we're talking about redistributive and regulatory roles, but useful to think about them together. So turning to, the core issue of workers and work in the digital economy, which I think, our presentations have really highlighted key issues here. But going back to earlier discussions of the narrative, we've got a narrative around technology driving, something good, claimed as a public good. Technology is a public good, contributing to development. Capital is leading this, but is often supported by subsidies, taxes, incentives, infrastructure investment, things from the state, i.e. the state is regulating to support that with the promise of jobs and economic growth down the road. And I think, again, Mary was, Abigail, I think, was suggesting, this kind of process, but regulation and state action then is favoring capital, but the benefits secondarily for labor, job creation, the terms and conditions work, etc., kick in later. So there's a chronology, which often means that state supports something which actually is against its long-term interests, and then has to pick up the pieces through social assistance. So I think these, primary, secondary chronology, hierarchy of actions by the state are worth unpacking a bit. And so this, obviously, technological innovation, the digital platform economy has happened in the context of a particular phase of capitalism with neoliberal globalization, financialization, etc., which means that small open economies, lower income economies have often had little comparative advantage on which to compete, except for their natural resources extraction, and Ruth also highlighted, and commodity price in context of commodity price speculation, and of course labor as part of now what's being termed the global reserve army. So very competitive on the platform, not just within locations, but at least for crowd jobs competing globally. So in these contexts, what role then, and what capacities, what instruments and mechanisms do such states have, either to regulate or to pursue an explicitly redistributive agenda? And I think those are the questions that really we've got some very interesting examples and specific cases from the speakers. And just thinking about a few of those, one obviously is the regulation of capital and the source of revenues for labor protection going beyond the minimum social protection. And COVID has put this more on the agenda for workers. How that happens, we've heard a little bit about basic income grants, and Ruth highlighted this a bit, but on the one hand, the state can be a provider, a guarantor of social reproduction, but for some that would seem like be interpreted as a subsidy also to capital. We've got the debates that Abigail pointed to of sort of delinking labor and social protection, a universal basic grant, the decommodification of labor, even though in some of these contexts it hasn't been commodified. So I think there's a lot of debate still around those ideas. And there's the renewal of the idea of social insurance that Ruth was talking about, how to hold capital accountable for paying its share. Regulation should obviously include issues of distribution, ensuring, and I think this is Mary's presentation, fair rewards to labor, wages, employment classification, as well as the more redistributive, or what often gets termed redistributive roles in terms of social pooling insurance. But these also require, and both the speakers have pointed this out, in the current context of informal employment, unstable jobs, lack of full employment and long-term stability in employment. It requires more fundamental rethinking or the development of systems that work in different contexts. And I think that's where we really are now with all these different ideas coming together, that there's going to be a need for some more fundamental rethinking. This obviously also in this redistribution requires resource mobilization. So what is the ability of states to tax or to raise resources or to hold capital to account in different ways? We know that the easiest way, well, one of the easier ways to tax is through VAT, which is largely regressive or tends to be more regressive. We know that redistribution can happen through, for example, state investments in health and education through a social wage, as well as through direct taxes. We also know that with the context of the digitalization service economy, financialized capital, this is a global issue, that it's very hard for states, whether in the North or the South, to tax digital transactions, digital firms effectively. And I think there's a lot of interesting work at the moment going on in terms of the UN and the EU in terms of how to tax platform companies. And so I think that will also be another thing to keep an eye on. Here, I think we've also got to think about the role of regional and international organizations when this capital is multinational, transnational. But at the same time, domestic policy legislation and clarity on what rights states will have to tax these transnational corporations will be important, as well as financial transaction taxes. So I think there are other ways of thinking about resource mobilization that need more attention in this conversation. And then I think the third sort of set of issues, are the employment creation side. And here I think we also need to bring in, thinking about industrial policies, what we can expect states to do in terms of creating employment in the real economy, and what role that other institutions, national, global, regional, for example, development banks, can play. And if we look at the sort of countries that have developed, we can talk about East Asia, we can talk about developmental or entrepreneurial states, where capital has been held accountable, has had to be patient, there have been longer term returns to productive investments, to new technologies in the economy, rather than the short-term financial returns of the current sort of system. And so I think, there's a role for really rethinking industrial policy and employment policy as part of the role of the state in supporting the creation of jobs, which is clearly critical. as well as investing in the education skills and public goods that are necessary for a productive workforce. And I think there's a lot of emerging literature really looking at these links between technology innovation and the state, which will be useful. So I think just to conclude, there are some key sort of opportunities. There are lots of challenges, and we've heard some of those challenges. And I think we also need to think a little bit about some of the opportunities. You know, what is it about platform capital, or the platform economy, digital, what opportunities does it offer? And I think, you know, some of these maybe see more challenges still at this time, you know, how to deal with this very competitive global reserve army of labor, how to deal with alternative forms of organization in this space, how to hold states accountable, either with new forms of power that we've spoken about in previous seminars, and what a new social contract can look like, which we've also, Ruth and Abigail have mentioned, how to invest, how to ensure investment in the productive economy, in the real production of goods and services. And I think some of that increasingly in this literature on innovation technology is linked to the green economy, the opportunities of extractive economies for actually produce the goods and the infrastructure for the digital economy also. So I think that, you know, there are some opportunities to think more constructively about the positive opportunities that the digital economy offers. We tend to focus on these challenges, but I think overall, in terms of the social contract, the social insurance, and the social protection that we're talking about, we are really at a point where we need to quite fundamentally rethink what kind of system is going to not completely de-link labor and social protection. I think that that's not going to be a financially sustainable sort of mechanism, but we do need a different system that can address the issues of informality, of unstable jobs, of high levels of unemployment, etc. So I think Ruth and Abigail and Mary have pointed to some interesting directions, and I look forward to the conversation.
Right, thank you so very much, Professor Sarah Cook, for nicely rounding up the discussion and just mainly pulling out main points. I would just like to remind everybody who is in the seminar that the recording will be made available and it will be put up on the SkillsFit YouTube page in case you would like to revisit this seminar. So I would like to just sort of like kick off the Q&A session, and please, by all means, if anybody has a comment or a question, you're more than welcome to post it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will try to have you on the floor and ask your question or pose your comment. So my question sort of like goes to Ruth and Abigail. I'm just like really thinking in terms of getting from Mary's presentation. I was just wondering if you, respectively, in the context of Mozambique and in the context of Nigeria, if there are ways that the judiciary systems can extend or enforce the regulation of digital economies. Yeah.
Okay, do you want me to go first? Okay.
Absolutely, yes, it's okay, thank you.
Okay. So I think generally, or one of the ways in which the judiciary could possibly extend protection to platform workers would actually require what is known as judicial activism. And it has been used in many jurisdictions where, for example, the judiciary in interpreting certain socioeconomic rights link those rights to certain in quote fundamental human rights. So, for example, the National Industrial Court, which is the court that presides over labor matters in Nigeria, has, in terms of the act, has jurisdiction to interpret ILO standards in extending protection to workers generally in Nigeria. So this could also be an avenue to extend protection to these workers. But let me just go back once again to the judicial activism. And this has been used in respect to environmental rights, which are also socioeconomic rights, and in Nigeria, which are also not enforceable. And this could be in terms of linking the right to decent work, for example, to possibly the right to life, the right to human dignity, all of which are fundamental human rights, which is what the court did some years back when the court was trying to enforce the environmental rights of some Nigerians in the oil region, where the courts, in trying to hold I think it was Shell or Chevron, I'm not sure what oil company now, but it was one of the big ones. I think it's Shell. When the court was trying to hold them responsible for some of the atrocities they had committed on the environment. So even though environmental rights are not enforceable, the court had linked it to, had connected it to the right to life. So this is one of the ways I believe that the courts can do this. But of course, this also requires like a form of judicial activity, as I said, the courts being willing to fill the gaps in regulation by doing things like this. But of course, then we still have to come back to the issue of regulation, because platform workers are still not classified as employees. So to what extent will the National Industrial Court, for example, be able to extend protection to people that are actually seen as independent contractors? That remains to be seen. But one of the ways to extend protection is linking labor rights to core fundamental human rights.
Should I jump in? I think the Mozambican case is interesting because actually our most prominent labor platform is something called Viva Taxi. It's an e-hailing service. And the workers on that e-hailing service are employees. So they receive a monthly wage. But when you go and you ask them, what are your conditions of work? They work 24-hour shifts, which is outside of the labor law, right? It's illegal. And so they are discounted if they drive, if there's like even a kilometer off between, you know, what they claim they drove on a piece of paper and what they charged for and what the petrol gauge is. So to some extent, the platform is used to impose high levels of control. But they are employees, yet the non-application of the Mozambican labor law, the weakness of the enforcement systems in Mozambique mean that there are widespread labor violations. And this is actually a group that's relatively well organized among precarious workers. So much so that they've been to the Commission for Mediation and Arbitration. They've been to the Labor Inspectorate. They've put in complaints, but the argument they say is the owners of our company are people that are influential in government, and this company is never held to account. So I would say that in some instances, it's a question of regulation and reclassification of workers. In other instances, it's about building power around the enforcement of labor protections. And to do that, you know, you need collective action of the kind that trade unions are capable of. But in a context of an authoritarian state where the trade union movement itself is very weak, then this becomes difficult. Bishkat is the opposite example. You know, many of the workers that are registered on that platform are people who do own to some degree the means of production. They may even hire employees. But that doesn't mean that they're wealthy, right? And so this is always the question: what is the right of people that are outside of employment relations? And what is the kinds of claims that they can make? And the argument we've made to the Mozambican state to rethink the question of cross-subsidization for social insurance has been to say, look, if you can get people in social insurance schemes, it'll reduce the weight on the social assistance schemes, even if you have to cross-subsidize in the short term. But in a context where there isn't a political movement around universal social protection anyway, then the government ends up, it ends up not moving ahead in that direction either, anyway.
All right, thank you so very much, Ruth and Abigail. We do have a raised hand from Hannah Dawson. Hannah, please, if you can switch your video on, and you have the floor to pose your question or your comment.
Hi, colleagues. I can't see how to turn my video on, but I have a few questions. First of all, just to say thanks very much to all our panelists. I think it was a very, very rich session. And in a way, Sarah's concluding remark on thinking about the regulatory and the redistributive role of the state as being kind of interconnected is a nice entry point to my question. I have two. So the one is maybe to all the panelists, but in particular Abigail and Mary, which relates to the kind of limits and possibilities of regulation, or, I mean, Abigail began to answer the question around judicial activism. Specifically, I wanted to ask Abigail, she spoke about the kind of issues with enforcement, and especially with digital labor platforms around the evasion of labor laws. And I think you began to answer, but if you have any more thoughts there on the role, the possibilities, but also the limits of a kind of legal response. To Mary, I was very interested in the fact that right at the beginning, you spoke about how 64% of these cases had been won, although towards the end, you spoke about how it's a limited number of kind of legal action when looked at the large scale of that work and that growing workforce. But I wanted to get a sense of who's bringing these cases forward. Are they coming from individual workers? Are they coming via trade unions or worker organizations? And what that tells us about the possibilities and limits of a kind of regulatory legal response. And then lastly, quickly, just to Ruth, I was also very interested in the kind of the move you showed us between 2015 and 2021 in Mozambique. And you ended right at the end really talking about the need to work very closely with worker organizations and own account workers in thinking about how best to extend these social insurance schemes. And I wanted to ask what the context, the history of that 2015 moment in Mozambique was, and to what extent the recommendation you have at the end was taken on board, and again, what that might mean for the 2021 moment. And of course, it's not clear if 52,000, how we should think of that number in relation to the large number of informal workers. Of course, the stat around 22% is not surprising given what else you shared, but it was just around that 2015 moment, what we might learn from that. Thank you.
Abigail, you can have the first step at answering the questions.
Okay. Thank you, Anna, for your question. Just to be sure that I got your question, you're asking your questions around the enforcement and compliance. Is that right? Okay, thank you. So generally, enforcement and compliance is actually a very big thing when we think about extending protection to workers. And it's not just even platform workers, even in certain respect, within even the context of Nigeria, it's also about even enforcement of rights, even for formal workers. which are workers that typically should be under labor within the scope of the labor statutes. But one of the biggest challenges to enforcement in Nigeria, just broadly, is the issue of very limited labor inspection system. Nigeria is has over 200 million people. More than half of that number are adults within the working age, employed in various sectors under various work arrangements. But particularly for formal workers, Nigeria has historically had challenges enforcing labor rights for these workers. Now, this means that for platform workers and even other kinds of workers that are typically not protected under the law, the issue of compliance is aggravated for these workers. And I think this also this also raises the possibility of also for platform workers, in the event of regulatory intervention, for us to have or to harness technology as a way to ensure compliance and accountability on the part of platforms. And this would of course require collective action on the part of all the stakeholders. It's not just for platform workers. For example, the new National Health Insurance Authority Act. One of the challenges, one of the debates around that particular act, which in words, on the face of it, extends health insurance to every resident in Nigeria. The biggest issue with that is compliance. How do you enforce it? So for platform workers, for example, yes, we can harness technology, but then it goes beyond that. It's also about, there's also the issue of attitudinal shift, like, which speaks to actually the commodification of labor, seeing people as not seeing the labor of people not as a commodity, but linking it to, for example, the right to dignity. So for me, even if we're to have regulatory interventions, compliance is also a big issue. And this is also linked to political will and corruption in Nigeria. So it's also like, to what extent is government willing to ensure protection for workers? Because if you leave it just to employers or platforms, we've seen historically that employers, platforms, whichever categorization we are giving or whatever name we're calling the employers, would always look for ways to avoid their responsibility under the labor regulation. So compliance and enforcement is basically a government issue, and there's also the need to equip the labor inspection system, for example, in a way that takes into consideration the uniqueness of platform work.
Thank you, Abigail. Mary, you can come in.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, for your question about the judicial decisions. We think we were winning in the judicial, in the courts about the declaration of the nature of the relationship between the workers and digital platforms. But you can see this, for example, in Latin America, we have, in Colombia, we have like 200,000 workers in digital platforms, especially in delivery and transportation. And we have in Latin America something like 3 million people working in digital platforms. And we have just 15 judicial decisions to declare the labor relationship between them and the digital platforms. And those the judicial decisions are for just one worker for each one. Then we have just 15 workers in Latin America that can say, I have a judicial decision in my favor. Then we have the rest of them with misclassification about their relationship. And we have identified the corporate strategies for avoid the judicial decision. For example, we have contracts signed with the digital platforms as independent contractors, sorry, and they deny rights with the assurance that the majority of workers will not sue, never, because they don't have lawyers, they don't have money, or they just need the employment, the precarious employment with the platform, because we have a high unemployment in our region, in Latin America especially. I imagine it's similar to your region, of course. The companies, for example, have clauses in their contracts for with indemnification clauses where if the worker present a complaint in a judicial scenario, they have to pay an indemnization to the digital platform. Of course, that is impossible. Or they have clauses where they obligate to the workers to present the complaint in the country where is from the digital platform. For example, if you want to present a complaint against Uber, you have to go to the UK. And that is, of course, impossible for the workers. And we have, for example, in recent cases, we were winning in Uruguay. We have 3 good decisions applying the ILO recommendation 198 and recognizing the labor relationship. And now Uber have this strategic if the worker present a complaint to the court, the Uber just pay some money to the worker and finish the process, because they have the strategic that don't allow that we have more judicial decisions that say that they have labor relationship, and they prefer to pay directly to 1 worker or 2 workers, or in the last month, 7 workers of Uber present the complaint, and Uber just negotiate and finish the case, and we don't have more new judicial decision to declare the real relationship between the platform and the worker. Then that is strategic. Of course, we think that our laws and our constitutions are enough for recognize that they are real workers. They have labor relationship, and they deserve the recognition, and they deserve the social protection in our countries. But the digital platforms have the power and have the money for negotiate with the few workers that have the valor to complain the companies.
Thank you so very much, Mary, for your feedback. I will give Ruth now the floor to also give some of her reflections. And after that, I will also give Sarah, and she can maybe give us some parting shots, and we will close the session for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a really excellent question. And I think sometimes we take these things for granted and we don't really think about, okay, well, what is behind it? And I would say that fundamentally, what was behind the extension of social insurance to informal workers in Mozambique was the rollback of the labor law. So it was the precaritization of the labor protections in Mozambique, which resulted then in this extension. And the reason I say this is that in 2007, there was a review of the labor law, which excluded key sectors from coverage as salaried workers. These included domestic workers, they included port stevedores, they included cultural workers, they included people in sports. There was a sort of list of 12 categories of what were effectively salaried employees that were excluded from the labor law and were supposed to then be incorporated in their own labor regimes because of the particularities, they would say, of the employment relation. And that resulted then in the loss of access to social insurance for those groups. And so between 2007 and 2015, there was a major gap in coverage. Now then came another debate, which was, well, okay, because they were defined as own account workers in this process. And there came a debate about how to incorporate them. Originally, the Mozambican government had suggested that they be incorporated at 20% of their income. And the ILO came with an actuarial study. The ILO does irregular actuarial studies of social insurance schemes around the world. And the actuarial study said, no, one can get, 20% is not acceptable. 7% would be the most one could put. But of course, actuarialists are not politicians, right? But this number then got seized on by worker organizations like domestic workers organizations. And there was a sort of big advocacy campaign around the inclusion of these excluded sectors. And I'll drop a film that we made in 2014 on this issue. And ultimately, the outgoing Minister of Labor, who had finished her mandate, wanted to have a legacy piece. And so rushed the inclusion of informal workers right before she left office.
Thank you, Ruth. Sarah, any parting shots in conclusion?
Well, first, I think that it's just been a very interesting discussion, particularly this last little bit when we start getting really deeper into the oops, sorry, my computer slipped, into the kind of nuts and bolts of what the states are or aren't doing, how they're trying to address these issues. So there's a lot of very specific, every case is different, but there are a lot of commonalities across them, and particularly in dealing with the power of, these platform companies and the platform capitalism. And so I think it really points to perhaps the need for actions which cut across the global, regional, and national levels that countries cannot address, even if they've got where they have the good legislation that Mary's sort of pointing to, or the judicial tools, whatever, but there's the power of these companies that are transnational or from elsewhere need some other kind of regulatory framework. So I think there's some real challenges here, both at the national level, but also for thinking harder about what role regional and global organizations play beyond these sort of conventions that we can draw on or some particular studies. So I think this is really the beginning of a very interesting sort of set of conversations that I hope we will find ways to continue, whether we're looking specifically at the social insurance scene, or whether we're looking at these other mechanisms of accountability, judicial issues, or whether we have, starting to think about the fiscal and taxation and how the resources of these of this kind of labor is shared. So thank you everybody for really thought-provoking presentations and inputs, and I look forward to finding ways to continue this conversation. Thanks also, Sapati.
All right, thank you so very much, Sarah. I also share your sentiments, really. It's going to be a long and continuous debate, and it's very much worth having. I would like to thank very much our panelists today, as well as our discussant. Really, really, really enjoyed your contributions, very insightful, very thought-provoking. It just kind of like makes us realize that we have a long way to go with, what the state can do, and like how we can, like, workers can be protected working in the gig economies on the African continent, as well as Latin America, and hopefully all over the globe. So thank you so very much, colleagues. And yes, it's a wrap. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sapati. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.